Map Chats.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Nash, and I'm the Director of Data and Product Development here at PolicyMap. I'm pleased to be introducing our Map Chat today. For those who are signing on to Map Chats for the first time, PolicyMap, the organization behind this webinar series, is a national online mapping service that provides maps and data visualization tools for tens of thousands of indicators related to housing, health, demographics, and more. Map Chats is a free webinar service that features experts from a variety of topics, including housing policy, healthy food access, creative placemaking, and more. Our speakers discuss how their work incorporates data and maps, giving our audience a chance to see firsthand the indispensable role of maps in the everyday work of practitioners and policymakers. Please note, this is a webinar format. Everyone is muted, but if you have any questions, and we hope that you do, please use the GoToWebinar panel. At any time, just type in your question into the control panel, and we will answer you directly or during the Q&A for all attendees. Also, we will be recording this Map Chat, and we will post it to our YouTube channel and our blog. So I'll start today by introducing our speakers, and then I'll turn things over to them. We'll then have a Q&A session at the end using questions that you've typed into the control panel, as well as questions that participants sent to us ahead of time. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished speakers, John Henneberger and Charlie Duncan of the Texas Low-Income Housing Information Service, also known as Texas Housers. John is the co-founder of Texas Housers and is a 2014 MacArthur Fellow. He has over 40 years of experience in housing advocacy work. He's working to define new standards for fair housing protections and affordable housing. Charlie Duncan is a fair housing planner with Texas Housers. He provides research and maps pertaining to housing, neighborhood qualities, and the socioeconomic conditions of communities across Texas. His work informs stakeholders in fair housing-related policy, including legislators, law firms, community organizations, and more. And now I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Henneberger. The Texas Low-Income Housing Information Service, we're a nonprofit, six-person policy development and advocacy organization. And we support low-income Texans' efforts to achieve the American dream of decent, affordable homes in quality neighborhoods. We've currently got offices in Austin, Houston, and on the border with Mexico in the Rio Grande Valley. Our current work focuses on access to housing and public services by people of color with low incomes, environmental justice in their neighborhoods, and expanding housing locational choice through fair housing advocacy. Our work model is to support neighborhood and community leaders of low incomes who represent organized neighborhood constituencies. We help these grassroots leaders analyze these issues, devise solutions, and then we support them in organizing their neighbors to advocate for social and racial justice. Charlie and I are going to present today in two different parts. In the first 15 minutes, I'll tell you about my background in using mapping and advocacy for social and racial justice. In the second 15 minutes, Charlie Duncan will present to you examples of the maps we produced that we created in support of the work of these neighborhood leaders, their advocacy, and their efforts to organize their neighborhood. And then at the end, I think there's going to be plenty of time for questions. Back in the mid-1970s, when I was 19 years old, I first became interested in the way that African American neighborhoods were impacted by municipal policies. This interest grew out of my community activism with leaders in a small historic African American neighborhood in Austin called Clarksville. Leaders there were battling, at the time I got involved, the potential expansion of a freeway which threatened to run lengthwise through the neighborhood, destroying the historic low-income community. And this neighborhood, ironically, was surrounded by the wealthiest Anglo neighborhoods in Austin. It was an old freedmen's community, which was originally located outside of town, but that got incorporated within the city as the city grew. At the same time that I got involved, the local community action program, led by long-term African American leaders in the community, were also trying to advocate for paved streets, drainage, and better housing. I was being trained at the time as an undergraduate at the University of Texas as an urban historian. And I decided that in order to get a handle on the forces that were at work in Clarksville, I needed to understand the historical movement of ethnic and racial populations in Austin. I wanted to see how these racial and ethnic housing patterns related to municipal policies like racial zoning, transportation infrastructure initiatives, school openings, and closings. You know, this was a real eye-opener for me. My middle-class sensibilities were really shocked to discover the extent to which Anglo-Austin elites had been using public infrastructure to force communities of people of color living outside of the city's preferred ghettos into those preferred ghettos and into racial and economic segregation. I found evidence that government conspired with Anglo real estate interests to expropriate the valuable property of poor people of color as they forced ethnic and racial minorities out of their homes in other parts of the city and into this officially designated and planned racial ghetto. The patterns I saw guided me to people who experienced and participated in this process, and I talked to them and I collected oral histories from them in order to better document and understand the process. As part of this work, I undertook an insanely tedious process of creating a punch card for every Negro and Mexican household, as they were then designated in the Austin city directories, who lived within the city of Austin. One card for each minority household for each year from 1869 through 1940. And I then generated a series of maps at 10-year intervals by manually placing a dot with a sharp pen on a map at the location of each African American and Hispanic household. Working with neighborhood leaders, we used this data to tell the story and to create a public narrative that gave context to the fight over the expressway as a civil rights issue. This small, isolated, and very persistent African American community ultimately succeeded in blocking the expressway, and they won public funds out of the then new CDBG program for infrastructure improvements and some affordable housing funds. This was my first experience with supporting grassroots-led action for racial justice, and I found it was absolutely one of the most rewarding things I'd ever been associated with. And since then, we basically repeated this same type of work in hundreds of places across Texas with countless community leaders of low income who inspire us in our work every day. For a few years in the early days of my career, I got a job with Legal Services Corporation back in the late 1970s when they were still permitted to bring voting rights cases. We worked in a whole lot of mid-size and small-size Central Texas towns to map the residential racial distribution of households and to correlate those housing patterns using residential dot density maps with the quality of public services in the different parts of town. In other words, the African American part of town, the Hispanic part of town, and the Anglo part of town. And we did this literally by driving every street in the community and noting whether the streets were paved, whether there was storm sewer drainage, whether there were street lights, fire hydrants, and the like. The resulting maps were key exhibits in the voting rights cases and the public services discrimination cases that we brought. And let me tell you, these maps, they really weren't very sophisticated, but they really were, it took a lot of time and manual effort to produce them. You know, I think the greatest mapping skill I had at that time was a willingness to spend literally hundreds of hours placing dots on a map with a pen and writing back and forth across streets to generate data where it didn't exist. And the maps proved to be hugely powerful in court. We won a lot of voting rights and public facilities discrimination cases. A dozen years later, an attorney working with Ralph Nader's organization, Public Citizen, called me up when he heard about some work I was doing on the bad type of subprime loans that Fannie Mae was buying in communities of color in Dallas and Fort Worth in order to meet their congressional affordable housing goals. So this guy comes down from DC and brings with him a copy of Esri's ArcInfo software, and he spent a week teaching me how to use it to look at the geographic distribution of loans and the type of loans that were purchased by Fannie in Texas. Together, based on those maps, we wrote a massive analysis critiquing Fannie's early forays into Alt-A and subprime lending products. Our report got a little bit, but not a lot of attention, but we did really succeed in pissing off Fannie Mae. Looking back now, what we were seeing then was really the advance of the practices that ultimately led to the collapse of Fannie Mae and the mortgage lending industry. The issues of subprime lending, they're really complicated, and we didn't have the advocacy power to get the attention to the problem to get action taken back then. So in the wake of that disappointing result, we resolved to return to our model of working with these housing and neighborhood equity issues at the community level, at the city level, at the neighborhood level, and stop trying to be a lone wolf advocate on broader public policy issues. There were these global sort of issues like Fannie and subprime lending and the like. But we saw basically that if we were going to be successful in advocacy, we wanted to get behind and support residents of communities to basically make the power of the moral argument that they could make on these issues. After that, we basically stopped mapping for several years because our two-person staff at the time didn't have the time to keep up and understand the ArcInfo platform. I mean, I was taught in it once, but it was changing all the time. The databases were changing all the time, and basically we grew rusty and stopped using it. But we knew all along that this power of maps to help people visualize inequality and to articulate it, what they feel, what they see in their neighborhood. That as a small organization, we just didn't have the time to do the mapping, but we really needed the resources to be able to use ArcInfo. So a couple of years later, we started recruiting graduate student interns in community and regional planning programs from the University of Texas, Texas A&M, and Texas State, who had learned Esri mapping software in their studies. So Charlie, who's going to talk to you in a minute, was one of those interns who started out in our office. And about a year ago when he graduated, we hired Charlie full-time. He's an amazing guy who can manage to make a map that people can understand. And now Charlie supervises the second community regional planning graduate student intern who's also doing mapping for us. We call Charlie in our office Mr. Map. He deserves this title not because he's just a whiz with Esri software, but because he has this remarkable ability to talk bureaucrats out of data sets that we need. And Charlie spends much of his time, he spends as much of his time as a data sleuth as he does actually doing mapping. So moving forward, Texas gets socked by a series of natural disasters, including this weekend, the massive floods we've been having down here, and low-income people, by virtue of the environmentally threatened areas that they live in, were devastated by these type of things. And we increased dramatically our use of mapping in order to analyze what's going on with recovery programs in the multitude of different communities in Texas that seem to get socked by every major hurricane or wildfire or flood that we endure down here. Hurricanes Rita, Ike, and Dolly brought with it $3.1 billion in HUD Community Development Block Grant funds to Texas. And we quickly needed to get a handle on where the need for disaster assistance was and where the state was directing those resources. which we knew from our historical studies might not necessarily be to people of color and low-income people. It's basically, this is the same old story that I've been studying since 1970, only on a statewide basis. The state ended up using public funds in a way that did not treat people in communities of color equitably. So we filed a fair housing complaint with HUD against the state of Texas over where the money was going and what the state of Texas was doing by way of disaster rebuilding. As part of our Fair Housing Conciliation Agreement, the state committed to redistribute geographically over $500 million of CDBG funds, proportionally assist low-income households and households of color in terms of the proportion they've been impacted by the storm, and dramatically increase funds for low-income people to be able to rebuild their homes. And most importantly, the state agreed to give us detailed, regular data on where the money was going, what it was being spent for, and data on race and income of the people they were assisting with disaster recovery. Separately, we managed to convince FEMA to give us data on claims, and we correlated damage data with where and whom the money was going to from the state. And through this, we've been able to redirect the expenditure of an awful lot of federal CDBG disaster recovery funds in Texas. Through this Fair Housing Conciliation Agreement, the state also made an explicit commitment to affirmatively further fair housing with HUD disaster funds, something they're supposed to do anyway, but we got it in writing and we got special enforcement powers, which meant that we had a very important opportunity to review public infrastructure and housing funding proposals up front before they were funded, along with a process through which we have the ability to challenge proposed projects that don't affirmatively further fair housing. And to do all of this, to manage all this across 65 counties in Texas, it's all about mapping for us. We've been able to have a huge impact on to direct the infrastructure funds to underserved communities of color, to direct home reconstruction funding to homeowners in those same neighborhoods, and to direct new multifamily housing affordable to the poor to be built in high opportunity communities. So what specifically do we map? As I said earlier, we're looking at the same problems today I started out working on in the mid-1970s in the Clarksville neighborhood. Discrimination in public services and public facilities between Anglos and people of color, especially looking at neighborhood inequality between Anglo neighborhoods and neighborhoods of people of color. Because we generally take a back seat and we support grassroots leaders to actually do their own advocacy, we're deeply committed to community organizing. We have a community organizer on staff who works as a consultant to community groups and who helps us understand what the community groups need and what the leaders need and what we need to do to support them with mapping tools and data analysis and policy solutions. We spend more time thinking about how to make the data useful to them and understandable to the community than we actually spend on mapping. Our assessment of, as I said, our assessment of disaster equity is really all about mapping. And we're working with the neighborhood leaders. Oh shoot, I just lost my notes here, so let me. I'm going to kind of wing it from here. Charlie, go to that slide. Supported by their own full-time community organizers, who are organizing citizens all across the city, and basically not all across the city, but in more than half of the African American and Hispanic dominant neighborhoods in the city. And this group really does organizing. They literally knock on 100,000 doors in low-income neighborhoods each year, and they talk with residents about their concerns. And these organizers groups, then they aggregate the concerns they hear on people's front porches when they talk to them, and then give it to us, and we analyze and map data to validate and document the type of problems that are being reported by people living in the community. The group has a set of leaders who are all low-income peoples of color, and they have a really sophisticated understanding of issues of race, class, and inequality. They also get local politics. They're fully engaged, and they are pretty sophisticated in working the local government administrative processes. We've hired a full-time person in Houston who's embedded with those community organizers, and Charlie and I go to Houston about once a week to meet for 3 or 4 hours each week with this leadership team of grassroots leaders. These guys have framed their fair housing and neighborhood rights campaign around 4 rights. The right to choose where to live, the right to stay and not be displaced from your neighborhood if you choose, the right to equal treatment between neighborhoods of color and predominantly Anglo neighborhoods, and the right to have a say in public policy allocation and resources. These 4 rights that the grassroots leaders came up with, to me, really sum up today's issues about inequality brilliantly. Our job is to help, as I said, is to help these grassroots leaders analyze what's standing in the way of securing each of these 4 rights. We present to the community organizers and leaders maps that document their perceived neighborhood inequalities. And it's maps that really give people the understanding of inequality. We provide them data that they can present in the form of these maps to their neighbors to show that the concerns that they perceive, the chronic flooding in their neighborhoods, the issues with substandard housing and the like are really valid. And it contextualizes these concerns in terms of neighborhood inequality across the whole city and the metro area. And we also work with the neighborhood leaders to develop some campaigns, basically demands that address the concerns that people voice in those conversations they have with the organizers on their front porches. Finally, on to how we map. So we are, I guess I'd say, meat and potato mappers. Nothing fancy, just data people can understand, laid out in a spatial plane that real folks are familiar with. This goes for whether we're mapping for a community meeting led by low-income neighborhood leaders, whether we're mapping to support a policy initiative that those leaders are presenting to local or state elected officials, or whether we're mapping to support a fair housing challenge to a proposed multifamily development presented to senior HUD officials. We strive, but we don't always succeed to make our maps simple. Our advocacy is on basic issues like where money and housing are going. We admire and we love to see the amazing maps and the sophisticated maps that other people produce, but the stuff we do is really simple stuff because we're advocates and we're not academics. But our maps get the job done, and for the folks that we support. And one more thing, and this is really important to how we use maps. We map really fast and we map a lot. We often get very short notice of decisions by government over housing development or a chemical spill in the neighborhood, or asked to review a contractor's track record for rebuilding homes destroyed by a disaster. Our pace of mapping is frantic at many times. Typically, we have between 4 and 48 hours at most to engage in a citywide geographic fair housing analysis and put in context particular developments that are being proposed. We either make this deadline or we lose our chance to have an impact. There's this mad scramble in our office for data and a mad mapping production. Because we can act quickly, however, and we can often have an impact far greater than anybody would suspect looking at our small staff and our small resources. One thing I haven't had the time to talk about today is about our interaction with HUD and fair housing and our use of maps to do that fair housing advocacy with the HUD division responsible. I hope maybe we'll get to that, some of the questions. And Charlie will show you some of our work in that area in just a minute. So with that all out of the way, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie, who will walk you through a small sample of some of the maps we've done in the past few months and I'll be glad to come back at the end and answer any questions I can. Thanks for listening.
All right, thanks, John. Hello, everybody. I'm Charlie Duncan, and I'm going to go through a few examples of our maps and the things that we consider in creating them. When we are reviewing a site for, its fair housing qualities, how good that area will be for the people living in it. We look at things like the concentration of race and ethnicity there, the concentration of poverty, the quality of schools that children would be able to attend, what are the crime rates and how do they compare to the rest of the city, is there public transportation nearby, are there job centers nearby, is there other subsidized housing in the area, is the city concentrating it in a particular area? Are there environmental hazards or other undesirable land uses like railroads or some source of noise in the area? And how has the city invested in infrastructure in this area and across the city? And with these, we look at what are the socioeconomic conditions surrounding existing and proposed subsidized housing. We identify these issues of in the placement of undesirable land uses and the existence of environmental issues as they relate to race, ethnicity, and income in a city. We do comparative analysis on how local and state governments are investing in white neighborhoods versus neighborhoods of color. And ultimately, we seek to influence housing policy by giving stakeholders some kind of spatial context in which to view how past and current policies are affecting neighborhood quality. So this map here is one that we would include in a site review. In this case, we got 7 proposals from the City of Houston as to public housing developments they wanted to build. And we took these sites and put them on a racial dot density map. This is a technique that, recently a man named Dustin Cable from the University of Virginia used and made these really neat maps of the entire nation, where you could scroll around and look at the distribution of different racial and ethnic groups across the city using dot density. One dot. His map, it was 1 dot equals 1 person. And so it's very data intensive, but really no way to match the picture you get of how these different groups are distributed across the city. And this is similar to what John was talking about that he did in the late 70s, the old-fashioned way, and he makes sure to remind me once in a while about how easy I've got it using ArcGIS to do this. So it's a really great tool. So here on this map, this is another example of using dot density to show race in a city. This is Beaumont in southeast Texas. And here we're looking at race, ethnicity, poverty, and the locations of several subsidized housing developments from different programs. This is actually a map that we presented to HUD to persuade Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity to not approve the rebuilding of a public housing development based on our fair housing metrics, particularly environmental issues in the area. And this one, I believe, the deputy secretary there took quite a fancy to, and it's hanging on her wall now in the office. So this is an example of something that we would show to HUD. In some cases, displaying their own data to them in a map, and really, it was open their eyes a little bit to what's going on in this particular community. In the lower Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, drainage is a really big issue. Stormwater drainage, flooding is rampant throughout the area. In this map here, I did a series of maps that allowed community organizers there to canvass colonias that lack infrastructure and to see which ones are benefiting from a CDBG disaster recovery funded drainage project, which are the areas circled in orange. Currently, we're working with the Water Development Board on their study of these colonias to identify the worst off colonias as far as stormwater drainage goes and guide future drainage projects to these areas. Also regarding disaster recovery, community development block grant funds were made available to rebuild, among other things, damaged public housing. In the case of the city of Galveston, I believe all of their public housing was damaged or destroyed by Hurricane Ike. And a faction of locals there came out and united against the rebuilding of that public housing. But we in the community prevailed, and they are being compelled to rebuild that housing. So a couple of studies were done to see what are the best areas in Galveston and Galveston County to rebuild this public housing and scattered sites housing, which is like single family and duplex homes for for affordable housing. And so we looked at these studies that that the city had contracted out, and we decided to do our own opportunity map study using our fair housing metrics I showed earlier to see where the best areas within Galveston would be to put housing.
And Shirley, I'll mention that we came in behind. We benefited from having the Kirwan Institute do an opportunity map of the Galveston area, but we were able to supplement that and really enrich that a little bit by actually having folks on the ground. We were working with the community group, and so we detected in the Kirwan study that some of the areas that were coming up, using census data from a distance and looking at things was, they really weren't opportunity areas. There were other factors, including environmental factors, which just weren't in the databases that Kirwan had access to. So we were able to basically inform it a little bit more by the information that folks on the ground locally had.
And so we used demographic data and other quantitative data like distance from certain types of features like environmentally hazardous land uses or parks, and created z-scores, and from that make an index as to the opportunity of that particular area. So this was kind of a fun project, honestly. It was time consuming, and given the time, I would love to do this for every city in Texas as a guide for what the best areas of the city are, but we'll see if that extra time ever comes. So more recently, we've been working in, doing a lot of work in Houston to look at inequality there. Back in October, Ira Goldstein from the Reinvestment Fund came and presented his market value analysis in a meeting that we and local community leaders there put together to present his findings from this market value analysis and talk a little bit about it with local community leaders there. We thought the market value analysis was a great jumping off point to see where the city's economic vitality stands today across the city and compare that spatial distribution to that of our fair housing metrics. So we took this map, which shows the strength and weakness of markets across Houston. The dark purple and blues are stronger markets, and the oranges and pinks and reds are weaker markets. And what I did was outlined the clear clustering of the strongest markets, A through C, and you can see that kind of rough arrow shape in West Houston there. And we can go and map a number of other socioeconomic and environmental issues in the city of Houston, such as race. Here's another racial density map. You can see, a clear concentration of white non-Hispanics within the arrow and not other groups there. Also, high incomes, low poverty, and a relative absence of environmentally hazardous land uses, which are particularly pervasive in the city of Houston, given the large heavy industrial and petrochemical presence in the city, and their lack of zoning, which has allowed a lot of what would otherwise be considered undesirable, or commonly considered undesirable land uses, to be scattered throughout much of the city, including right next door to people's homes, but not so much within the arrow, where there are a lack of minorities, a lot of wealth, and the good stuff, if you will.
And one thing I'd like to say about this is it was really interesting. This is a lot like what happened with the Kirwan map, where basically Kirwan gave the community a tool to visualize in general what the problem was, and they refined it. Well, here in Houston, the reinvestment fund came in and created this market value analysis map, which takes a little while to get your head around. But the grassroots leaders that we're working with, they got it. They spent time with IRA, they spent time with us, they looked at these maps, and they really talked about it for hours and hours and hours, that original TRF map. And that map had been commissioned by the city of Houston from TRF, but it didn't look at race because the city was scared to death to actually look at race. And that was the elephant in the room. So, we were able to build incrementally on this more advanced work than what we're probably capable of doing, and that the reinvestment fund did. And then simply to take that, do the outline like Charlie did of the arrow, and then drop it on a racial dot map, and like the community leaders go, damn, this is what we've been saying all along. The African American and Hispanic neighborhoods are basically getting the short end of the stick. So, I just want to go ahead, Charlie. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no worries. So from this particular map here with the environmentally hazardous land uses, I was able to get data on where complaints have been fielded by the city's Bureau of Pollution Control, the nature of the complaint, and how often those complaints resulted in a notice of violation, and found that very often complaints within the arrow pertain to construction noise and dust, whereas most of the complaints outside of that area pertain to more permanent sources, such as light and heavy industrial land uses and things of that nature. So it goes to show that the nuisance law that Houston relies upon is not a very good check on protecting people from environmental hazards. So finally, most recently, we've been looking at infrastructure inequality in Houston. There's a long history of neglect in minority neighborhoods in Houston when it comes to infrastructure. To see where Houston stands in more recent history and how they plan to address this in the future, we acquired GIS shapefiles showing where Public Works has made improvements since the late 90s or so, as well as their most recent capital improvement plan, and correlating those to the racial makeup of the population by block group. These block groups we broke up into those having less than 50% minority groups, 50 to 85% minority, 80 to 95% minority, and over 95% minority. By breaking it up into these categories, we ended up with approximate quartiles of both population and area for the city of Houston. This particular version of this map shows where open drainage ditches are throughout the city, as opposed to a closed storm sewer, and which of those open drainage ditches are being inadequately served by the ditches, which is the areas in black. And you can see a lot of them are located in parts of far northern, eastern, and southern Houston, where there is a higher proportion of racial and ethnic minorities. So from this map, we created a series of pie charts that provide a clear visual of the disproportionality of past infrastructure projects by overlaying the public works data. These two here show the proportions of the city's population and area accounted for by block groups with a particular proportion of minority populations. So you can see there, not exact, but approximate quartiles for each group. When these are put next to these here, we can compare the pie charts to these, which show the infrastructure projects that have been placed and where they have been placed in the past 15 to 20 years. You can see how the majority white block groups, which are in blue, have received a disproportionate amount of street and drainage improvements compared to their proportion of both area and population within the city. Despite the fact that most of the open drainage ditches, of which about half provide an inadequate level of drainage service, are located in minority areas of the city. So that's a sampling of some of the ways that we are using mapping here in our work at Texas Low-Income Housing Information Service.
Thank you both so much. That was a really fascinating presentation. We appreciate the time that you took to share that with us. We have an overwhelming number of questions. So I will start with one of the first ones that came in. And this is related to environmental justice. So Lauren Haberle from the University of Louisville asks, how do you suggest addressing the problem of using the maps to show correlation versus causation? Maps are great for policy conversation starters, for showing, for instance, the uneven distribution of environmental harms across geographies, and are more likely to be located in areas with high concentrations of minorities, as you've shown, or low-income households. However, I worry about maps being used to show the prevalence of contamination, historical and ongoing, so that companies can then just say that they are one of many and that you can't pin the cause on them. I guess the question is addressing the problem of showing correlation versus causation. I guess this is a question probably for Charlie.
Well, some of that I think would come down to knowing when the source of environmental contamination appeared. There's one case in Houston where a facility was originally permitted in the year 2000 when there was already a well-established residential neighborhood and schools in the area. And the city permitted, as well as the state, permitted this facility, which started out as a truck and tank wash facility and later got into industrial wastewater reclamation, where they're pulling out harmful substances and chemicals out of water. They allowed that facility to be there. And allow them to expand their processes and their activities into increasingly hazardous things. So in this case, that was already an established African American neighborhood that this was developed in, rather than being an already contaminated area that development was allowed in. So, I mean, I think with what we've looked at with respect to environmental justice, it can go both ways. There's certainly cases where development takes place where contamination exists, and there's certainly cases that we have found of undesirable land uses, such as landfills and heavy industrial land uses being put in an area of racial and ethnic minorities.
Right.
I hope that answers the question.
No, that's great. Thank you. Another question we had was a clarifying question that was from Aurora Mail Salazar, and she was asking what the name of the community organizer is that you mentioned.
The name of our community organizer is Liz Wolf.
Okay.
And the organizations that the formal community organizing groups that we work with in Texas are the Texas Organizing Project in Houston, which is the largest organizing group in the state. La Union del Pueblo Entero in the Rio Grande Valley, which is the former United Farm Workers Union, and a group called Arise, which is a group of colonial women in Starr County. We work with a group in Houston, the Galveston Coalition, the Galveston Coalition for Justice, which is part of the Interfaith or IAF network. So we're working with community organizers who work with the mainstream. Many of the top members used to be associated with ACORN. We work with, in Galveston, it's a group that's affiliated with the Industrial Areas Foundation and United Farm Workers, and a whole variety of small community groups and large community groups doing organizing.
Great. Okay. I have a question from Jay Young. He's asking, do you get your data for the maps you made mostly from the census, or what other sources do you use?
We definitely get it from, we use census data. I've been getting a lot of it through the NHGIS, which is an outfit out of the University of Minnesota that I think makes census data a lot easier to acquire, and they just use current and historical census data. They put it into a very easily searchable database, and they also supply you with shape files, historical and current shape files that have a unique field for joining. So you got a table and you've got a shape file. They're all readily joinable in GIS, so it's a really useful resource. You get a lot of census data from there, and I get a lot of data from cities. Whether I can download it from their website, whether I can call somebody in the department and they will just give it to me if I can, talk to them nice, or oftentimes I just have to resort to submitting a Public Information Act request and going through that way. And most of the time, more often than not, that results in the data I was looking for. Sometimes it's kind of a challenge to get it, but a lot of it I get directly from cities.
Charlie, I mentioned
EPA and TCEQ.
Yeah, I mentioned that we also have a unique data set in Texas. About 15 years ago, we got the legislature to direct the state housing agency to require that subsidized housing providers provide at the project level information about the income, ethnicity, race, disability status, and presence of children and use of Section 8 vouchers in all subsidized housing developments. So because we do a lot of looking at fair housing and multifamily housing, it's a huge advantage to have that data source. And that's something that we went to the legislature and fought for and managed to get.
Great. So related to your fair housing work, we've had a couple of questions come in about the proposed AFFH assessment tool from HUD and how that's affected your work. And the question being if you support this rule as is, or if you'd like to see changes. That's from Christian, Robin, and a couple of other people, actually.
We filed comments with many others on the proposed rule. We're very much supportive. We think it's essential. We're worried about the quality of the data that HUD's making available, and we're worried about the review standards, which are pretty weak. and what's the formalized process for community organizations to be able to challenge local actions. So, you know, we're holding our breath. We understand that it's imminent that the rule is going to be finalized and announced by the president, and you know, we're excited about it, but we're also very worried that HUD's going to give people a bunch of bad data and that the bar is going to be set too low. But, you know, full speed ahead.
Great. Okay. I have a question for Charlie from Kamal Jandalikani. I hope I pronounced that correctly. What measures do you use to determine school quality? Do you use anything other than grade schools?
We often consult the ratings put out by the Texas Education Agency. Anyway, we used to like them more because they had a nice gradient of the way that they would score schools. Now they've resorted to basically a pass-fail standard that says they either met the standard or they need improvement. So more recently, we've been using the children at risk scoring that has come out. You know, we given our the amount of work we've been doing in Houston, we really like them there because the mayor endorses that particular grading system, which is interesting because they do not paint the schools of Houston in a very nice light. But that's what we have been using for schools most often as of recent. I still like consulting the TEA data because they do have a lot of good indicators about the percent economically disadvantaged students. They give you a racial and ethnic makeup of the school body, the student body, test scores, and the like.
We know that this data is terrible, and that this is all fraught with error, with issues. You know, look, we're advocates. You know, we looked for a reasonable indication of school quality. This outfit, nonprofit group, Children at Risk, it's probably, they've got a fairly sophisticated method of doing an analysis, looking at data that's reported. It's hard to look at it longitudinally because the measurements change all the time. We are very cautious about school quality, but you know, basically we're making decisions about where multifamily housing is going to be located in a city, and we don't have a luxury of not looking at school data, so we try to take the least worst data and compare schools relative in performance to one another and make a call, weigh that in the consideration. But we never make a recommendation on a fair housing siting solely on school data. We're going to look at a proprietary crime data that we get. We're going to look at deterioration in the neighborhood. We're going to look at the economics of households in the neighborhood. We're going to look at the environmental hazards in the neighborhood. You know, it's tough. The school quality school data is very problematic.
Yeah, agreed. There's a lot of different ways that people do it. So.
Okay. Sounds good. And I think we have time for probably one more question. This comes from Jose Martinez Flores. And he is asking, do you guys look at the public health impact of areas with a large number of environmental hazards?
We have relied upon some studies that have been done by local health departments and incorporated those where they are available. There is some really good work in Houston, fortunately for us. And basically, we submitted the health department study data and convinced HUD to order a multifamily subsidized development to not be rebuilt, but to be placed in another neighborhood based primarily on those health reports. We don't do, per se, any evaluation ourselves on health data, right, Charlie?
No, I mean that, especially when you're dealing with things like airborne pollution, it requires a lot of modeling and, really frankly, like a background in chemistry, knowing how different contaminants can travel and their effects, and that's just something that we don't do. So we do rely on work that's already out there or studies that have already been performed in the area. And like John said, a lot of this has been done in Houston specifically, given the number of heavy industrial petrochemical facilities in that area.
We're just, as I said, meat and potato mappers. I mean, we're concerned about using maps for people to be able to make claims for social justice and to comment upon whether subsidized housing ought to go in point A or point B. And, we leave those more sophisticated modeling and that to guys like probably are on this phone call. And do some more of it and make it available for Texas, and we'll use it.
Great. Okay. So as I mentioned, we have a tremendous number of questions. This only scratched the surface of some of the questions that people asked. So we will pass along all of the questions to our presenters, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of them together. So after this call. So it looks like we've come to the end of our hour. I want to thank our presenters. This has been a very interesting conversation, and I hope that everyone in the audience found it valuable. The webinar will be available online at policymap.com/mapchats, and we will also be sending it and the presentation slides out by email to all attendees. We will also be sending you a survey, so please do take a minute to fill that out and let us know what you thought, as well as any suggestions for other Map Chats topics that you would like to see, or ways that we can improve our webinar series. The next Map Chat will be in June, and it will be on the topic of creative placemaking. We will be sending out a sign-up link soon. I also want to take a moment to let everyone know that in addition to the tools mentioned by our panelists today, PolicyMap offers quick and easy mapping and data visualizations tools for free to the public. There's also a wealth of other data and features available for PolicyMap subscribers that can help you with your fair housing work. In addition, we offer site licenses to cities across the U.S. with customized access to many of the indicators that you've seen today, although certainly not all of them, considering what Charlie has had to do to get them. If you've not done so, I encourage you to sign up for a free 7-day trial of PolicyMap to explore how it can help you and your organization use data to make smart decisions. So, thank you very much.